Let's begin by talking about Thomas Mann. There's literally hundreds of ways in which we could approach this topic. When I speak to students, I generally like to begin by talking a little bit about Thomas Mann's place in larger European literary history. Mann was born in the year 1875. He died in 1955. That places him pretty much at let's see. Why is this not? There we go. That places him pretty much at the center of one of the most important generations of authors, I would argue, in literary history. The modernist generation, which for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to define very idiosyncratically. This is just my personal definition as people born between roughly 1865, 1885. That is a cohort that, when we look at European novelists, includes people as important as Marcel Proust, Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, Franz Kafka, and smack in the middle of all that, Thomas Mann as well. This is, I would argue, the most important generation of prose writers to emerge in European letters since the generation of the 1820s or so, which is a generation that would include people like George Eliot, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Lev Tolstoy, Theodor Fontane in Germany, who was a huge influence on Thomas Mann. That earlier generation, the generation of writers born in the 1820s, that was sort of the generation that created 19th century literature, at least the 19th century novel. I'm really focusing on prose stylists and on novelists in these lists here. And they did that because that was sort of a generation that was born after the whole turmoil at the end of the 18th century, the Napoleonic Wars, the various independence movements that came up in the direct aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. After all that had died down and the 19th century settled into some kind of stability. And I would argue that the modernist generation that I'm talking about here very similarly benefited from the coincidence of having been born at pretty much exactly the right time. They were born in the second half of the 19th century into an age when Europe had known stability for an unprecedentedly long time. There hadn't really been any major wars in Europe since the end of the Napoleonic Wars. There were the 1848 revolutions, which were pretty bloody in some parts. There were the various wars of national unification, the most important of which was the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. But these were all relatively minor conflicts compared to what the Napoleonic era had witnessed and what other eras in prior histories, in prior centuries in Europe had witnessed. So a relatively, an age of peace, of stability, of economic prosperity. They were born into that. They benefited from the high literacy that came with that, the relatively good public education that came with that. But then they came of age. They entered their writing stages around the turn of the century, which is when the first cracks in the old 19th century system started to appear, with the full advent of imperialism, which set the various European countries on a course of war towards one another, various economic crises as well. And in their early fiction, these authors begin to respond to that. That is, they begin to see the old system that they've inherited for literary writing, the system of the realist novel, which had been put into place by that generation of 1820 that I talked about earlier. That was no longer fully adequate to the task. And they began to explore alterations to that way of doing things within literature. And then the First World War hits in 1914. At around the time that all these writers hit the peak of their powers. They're in their 40s now, roughly speaking, and they've done a lot of literary experimentation. They've gotten their first publications out, and the reason why these five writers, the four on the screen and Thomas Mann, I think are still read 100 years later, and whereas other members of their generation are maybe not, is that they respond to the enormous challenge of the First World War, which really turns the world upside down And we can discuss that a little bit further in our discussion of the Magic Mountain in the question and answer period. And the Magic Mountain, of course, is very much a novel that reacts to the First World War. They respond to that tremendous challenge by really blowing up literature and inventing something totally new. James Joyce does that with Ulysses. Franz Kafka does it with The Trial, for example. And Thomas Mann does it with The Magic Mountain. If we move beyond literature into other realms of artistic production, some other people who fit the same kind of paradigm that I'm talking about here are Pablo Picasso in painting, Arnold Schoenberg in music, all people that belong to that generation, and Schoenberg also a person whom Thomas Mann knew well. They were basically neighbors later in life, had a very interesting connection between them, but that's neither here nor there at the present moment. I also want to show you, this whole generational dynamic applies not just to art. We have people like Albert Einstein, who around the same time that these figures here reinvent modern art, reinvents physics to create a 20th century version of physics. We have Henry Ford, who admittedly is a little older. He's also American, so he doesn't fit in quite as well as the other people here, but who changes capitalism forever and changes the social structures, lays one important foundation, modern capitalism, for the social structure of the 20th century. And then, of course, if we're talking about social structure, we also can't ignore these two people, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin and Benito Mussolini, who also belong to that same generation of 10 years plus minus Thomas Mann that I talked about earlier. Hitler is just a little bit younger than that, but he ultimately also almost fits into this generational paradigm. And what Lenin and Mussolini, of course, have in common is that they create political forms that radically belong to the 20th century, that are very, very different from the 19th century. Lenin's version of communism, Bolshevism, is not Marx's version. It's very much a 20th century version. And fascism is also ultimately a product of the 20th century. So Thomas Mann, this is sort of the first note that I want to hit in this presentation. Thomas Mann is oftentimes, I think especially here in America, treated as more of a traditionalist. I mean, if you've read Joyce before, I know this same reading group a few years ago looked at Joyce, or even if you've read Virginia Woolf, Thomas Mann can seem almost timid by comparison. But I want to urge you to think of him, as you continue reading him, as belonging in this category of people, of being a modernist, not just a continuation of the 19th century, of the great 19th century realist novel, which has certainly influenced Magic Mountain to a large degree, but as an innovator. I want to illustrate that with what I've just said by appealing a little bit to stories that you read earlier in this reading group and recapping them for you. So Antonio Kröger, which I believe is the first thing that you read for this reading group, by my argument, very, very much belongs in this early stage of Thomas Mann writing, this phase at the beginning of the 20th century where he is finding his sea legs, so to speak, and is starting to explore how to revolutionize 19th century fiction. There are lots of things in Antonio Kröger that seem fairly traditional. There is a relatively traditional omniscient narrator. There's an omniscient narrator in many 20th century novels as well. That by itself is not a decisive kind of thing, but it's certainly a standard device that we would find in the 19th century novel as well. There's nothing particularly original there. It is by form a novella. That is, it's a little bit longer than typical short stories, but definitely shorter than the novel. This is also very much a 19th century literary form, especially in Germany, that has to do with the rise of print culture. In the late 19th century, newspapers were everywhere, magazines were everywhere, and magazines that had a lot more text and a lot fewer images than magazines do nowadays. And the novella fit perfectly into these late 19th century magazines. It took up just the right amount of space to draw in subscribers. So that is one backward-looking way for Tonio Kröger. Tonio Kröger features relatively traditional bourgeois characters. It's set in an artistic milieu, but they're definitely sort of upper class. You know, they do not seem altogether out of place in, say, an Oscar Wilde setting or something like that. They're very genteel. And it focuses on what is, or it shares a thematic similarity with what is the great obsession of German literature and the German novel in the 19th century, namely what the Germans call Bildung, that is the development of the protagonist from youth to adulthood. This is actually a standard trope in all of European literature, but the Germans were especially interested in it. Very much the dominant theme of the 19th century. And it's a theme that can only really work within stable societies, right? If you live in a time of revolution, you're probably not going to write a story that ends with the protagonist finding a stable place in society. That is the type of story that arises in societies that are relatively stable in nature, like the 19th century was. And Tonio Kröger is a story like that, but it is also a story that definitely points forward towards modernism, in that it introduces what will be the greatest theme of Thomas Mann throughout his life. You can find it in various forms in everything that you've read and are going to read. It's maybe not as much in the foreground in The Magic Mountain, although it's there as well, and we can talk about that later if you want to, but it's definitely in all the other stories that you read. That is that there is an irreconcilable conflict between art and everyday life. This is something that Thomas Mann felt very strongly himself. If you return to, or if you think about pre-modern societies, let's use as a really stark counterexample, let's use the medieval period. In the medieval period, there was no conflict between art and everyday life, right? If you think about what is the great artistic expression of the medieval period, it's the medieval cathedrals with all their statuary, their stained glass windows, and so on. And the people who worked on these cathedrals were artisans. They were integrated into their societies. They were at the center of their societies. By the late 19th century, when Thomas Mann grows into his own, artists are sort of weird people. You know, capitalism has taken over, the differentiation of society has taken over, meaning that when you're done with school, you're going to focus on a specific career, probably if you're upper middle class, and you're going to acquire subject expertise in that career. And artists are just one of those possible careers, and they're slightly weird people, slightly different from other people. So for Thomas Mann, it was always a big question of his life. How can he be an artist and yet remain at the center of society? He did not want to be a bohemian. He did not want to be a weirdo. He wanted to be commercially successful, certainly, but also socially successful, and he wanted to be respectable. And a lot of his stories deal with the theme, is that still a possibility for the artist? And if it's not, what even is the role of art in the 20th century? And that theme is very much highlighted in Tonio Kröger and points forwards towards the 20th century. Now, if we look at the other end of Mann's career, I'm now focusing on the story that I believe you read after Tonio Kröger, and which is the one that of all the ones that you're reading for this book club is chronologically the latest, Mario and the Magician. I mean, Thomas Mann still has 25 years to go after this as a writer. He gets more experimental and weirder still after that, to the extent that Mario and the Magician is a weird tale. It's not really very weird. But I would argue that there's a gulf between Mario and the Magician and Tonio Kröger almost 30 years earlier. Mario and the Magician, from my perspective, is much more clearly a product of the 20th century. It has a first-person narrator. We're not entirely certain if we can totally trust this narrator. He's not unreliable in the way that say, Nabokov's characters or something like that are unreliable. But as you read the tale, I'm hoping one of the things you ask yourself is, well, is everything that he's telling us, that this narrator is telling us, the truth? The characters in the story feel much more modern than the ones in Tonio Kröger. I call them here middle class rather than bourgeois. They feel like they're a product of the 20th century. They go on vacation in Italy, for example, which is like the most German thing you could possibly do. Take an Italian beach vacation. Um, there is, of course, in the story, the thematic focus on mass politics, on charismatic leadership, and on fascism. One way in which one can read the tale, sort of the easiest way to read the tale, is as an allegory of fascism, of course. That is very much a 20th century preoccupation. The Thomas Mann of 1903 would not really have understood what that even meant, charismatic leadership. But there are also elements in it in which we continue to recognize the older preoccupations that were already there in Tonio Krüger. It's still fairly much a realist setting and tone. It's not like experimental in the way that Joyce or Woolf are experimental. And the theme of art versus life that I addressed earlier is also present in the story because the Tupola, the evil hypnotist, can very much be read as an artistic figure, right? He's a little bit like a puppet master who treats the people that he's manipulating as if they are on strings. And he's weird. He's not entirely part of polite society. So there's something of the artist about him. And in fact, Thomas Mann had a lifelong preoccupation with the way in which the Nazis, especially the top-ranking Nazi officials, and especially Hitler, resembled artists. He wrote a famous essay called Brother Hitler, in which he basically said, Hitler is my brother. And Hitler, of course, was a failed painter, so he was an artist. And Thomas Mann thought that that was really important. He thought, like, if you have an artistic disposition and it goes wrong, then becoming, a manipulator of people is one way in which that can happen. Okay. So that's one way in which we can talk about Thomas Mann. Another way in which people frequently talk about Thomas Mann is in terms of intellectual history. Thomas Mann, more than most other authors, he was extremely well read and is oftentimes discussed through his intellectual influences as though he were just a continuation of the philosophers and the art theorists that he had read. I'm personally not a huge fan of that particular approach to Thomas Mann because I feel like literature should not just be treated as an ancillary to intellectual discussion. But it's nevertheless true that you need to be aware of these connections to understand what is going on in Thomas Mann. His art really demands that. So I want to speak very briefly about that. And I want to speak about Thomas, what I call here, this is my English translation, Thomas Mann's three intellectual lodestars. In German, Thomas Mann talked about these three figures as his Dreigestirn, his three-starred constellation. It's also sometimes translated as his Trinity. These are the people that he admired the most, that he read through. I mean, he read them in youth, and they're present in his fiction from the very beginning. But he reread them throughout his life, and they have a huge influence on him. The philosophers Arthur Schopenhauer and Friedrich Nietzsche, and then, of course, the composer Richard Wagner. I'm not going to talk, for reasons of time, I'm not going to talk about Schopenhauer here, in part because the stories that you've read up to this point so far are not the best to necessarily illustrate the influence of Schopenhauer on Thomas Mann. When you get to later chapters in The Magic Mountain, which you haven't read yet, Schopenhauer is very much present there, but I don't want to work with materials that you haven't read yet. So let's focus on Wagner and Nietzsche very briefly. That's going to give us more than enough to talk about anyway. And I want to talk briefly about the influence of Wagner and Nietzsche on Death in Venice. So Death in Venice, which you also read, is a story that has oftentimes been read as being very much influenced by these two figures. How so? Well, if you're familiar with Richard Wagner, if you've ever heard a Richard Wagner music drama, you will know that Wagner works with a compositional technique called leitmotifs, right? That is, there are things that recur over and over again in his compositions that have a specific meaning attached to them, and that meaning develops over time as the same musical motif, the same set of notes, is inserted into different contexts and is colored by the contact with these different contexts. And this is something that you can find in all of Mann's stories. When you read Mann's stories, you should always look for the stuff that repeats, that is mentioned repeatedly. And you should think about what might that mean and how does it develop and get more complex over time. Mann is fascinated by eyes and teeth, for example. That is happens in a number of stories, including in The Magic Mountain. In Death in Venice, some of the leitmotifs that you can find are the repeated references to Hermes-like figure, Hermes, the messenger of the gods. The color red comes up over and over again. Tigers come up over and over again. Gondolas, fittingly, because it's set in Venice, and then Taju in sculptural poses, being compared to a classical sculpture, specifically the Spinario, which is a famous Greek sort of pose for statues of a young boy twisting his body to extract a thorn from his foot. Taju is compared to that on a number of occasions throughout the story. So this idea of giving unity to a story through leitmotifs is something that he takes from Wagner. Then the idea of a love death is directly taken from Wagner's Tristan and Isolde. Aschenbach, of course, dies because of the cholera on a surface level. But if you leave it at that, you haven't really understood Death in Venice, right? He dies because he is consumed by his love, his illicit love for Taju. And that is an idea that you can die of love that comes directly from Wagner as well. And then, of course, the whole idea of Venice as a site of decadence where art overcomes the strictures of real life is also something very Wagnerian. Wagner died in Venice himself, and Wagner was very much a decadent figure. He liked to dress in sumptuous satin and velvet, and this brings us back to this theme of art versus life, like the idea that there's something corrupting about devoting yourself to the art, that you're not quite like other people. Venice serves as an expression of that taken to the extreme. And the same with Friedrich Nietzsche, who really influences Death in Venice as well. Nietzsche was he was a philosopher, but he had a university position as a classicist. He was throughout his life obsessed with Greek myth. And of course, Death in Venice is also very much a story that is influenced by Greek myth. All the references to Hermes, to Dionysus, to Charon with the gondola scene, satires throughout the story. So there's a connection between Mann and Nietzsche there. The whole idea of a contrast between the Apollonian and the Dionysian. So Nietzsche believed that there are two sides to human existence, also two sides to human societies. The Apollonian, that is the rational, that which has been given form, and then the Dionysian, that which is irrational. In 20th century parlance, we would say maybe the unconscious, that is, and that tends towards the formless. And Aschenbach's journey, of course, is one from a champion of the Apollonian to the Dionysian at the very end. And his decline is very fittingly so overshadowed by these repeated visions of Dionysus that he has. And then something that I stress with all my students that is really important in understanding Thomas Mann and talking about Thomas Mann is that Thomas Mann, like Friedrich Nietzsche, always operates with a logic of both and not with either or. A lot of more traditional philosophers despise Nietzsche because they think he's a weak thinker. He's sort of muddle-headed. He's never clear about his terminologies. He's not very logical. I'm not a philosopher. That's not for me to judge. What I can say is that Mann, as a disciple of Friedrich Nietzsche, is also like that. One of the greatest mistakes that you can make in reading Thomas Mann is thinking, I figured out what this means. Element X in the novel that I'm reading actually means Y. well, X may very well mean Y, but there's probably three or four other things that it means as well. These things are all overlayered with one another. And the interesting thing about Thomas Mann is figuring out the clash of those layers or the interaction between those layers. When a certain element of a story means two different things, what does it tell us about those things that it stands for? That is really the question that you need to approach Thomas Mann with. He's not a very logical writer in the ordinary sense of logic. Okay, so moving on to the final third of my presentation. So I've talked about Thomas Mann's position in general European literary history. I've talked about some of his influences. And those influences, by the way, were very much also the influences of his generation in Germany. Schopenhauer, Wagner, Nietzsche, these were tremendously influential people on a lot of people who grew up in Germany in the last 30 years of the 19th century. In fact, there have been some attempts made to trace the rise of Nazism to the obsession with those figures. I personally don't think that's very convincing. But what I've given you so far were variations on the theme, okay, this guy was born in 1875. What can that tell us about his art? In the final third, I want to give you a more straightforward summary of his life, a more straightforward biography. I don't think that biography are necessarily the best ways in which to approach fiction, but Thomas Mann led an extremely interesting life, and for more than most other authors, his life story is interwoven with his own fiction. So I do think it makes sense to dwell a little bit on what his life was like, but I want to connect that with each slide to some elements of the Magic Mountain that you might want to think about. So to begin with, Mann was born in 1875, as I already said, into an old and well-established merchant family in Lübeck on the Baltic Sea. So if you have a mental map of Germany before you, Lübeck is on the Baltic coast, almost where the Danish border is. So at the very, very north of Germany. It's an old Hanseatic town. It's a town that has a proud history going back to the Middle Ages, as you can see by the architecture that I highlighted on the right side. Very much a Protestant Lutheran town, a very stolid town that was once rich, one of the richest cities in Europe in the late Middle Ages, though by the late 19th century, very much down on its luck. That's also an important thing to understand about Thomas Mann and his obsession with declines, with decadence. It's a beautiful town to this day, though. So if any of you is planning a journey to Germany for holiday anytime in the future, and you're looking for some destinations off the beaten path, I can highly recommend Lübeck, and they have a brilliant Thomas Mann museum, which is unfortunately currently closed for renovations, but the town is worth visiting for other reasons as well. So that's where he was born, into a prosperous merchant family, but his father died when he was relatively young. And his mother moved to Munich in Bavaria in the south of Germany, and Mann followed her there to pursue a career as a writer. His older brother, Heinrich Mann, was also a very, very famous writer. I'm not going to dwell on him in this presentation, but if you've ever seen the classic movie from, I believe, 1930, 1929, 1930, The Blue Angel, with Marlene Dietrich, that is based on a Heinrich Mann story, Thomas Mann's older brother. There was very much a sibling rivalry between the two of them, and that's an interesting story in and of itself, but I'm not going to go into that. I just want to point out that when he was relatively young, when he started writing, he moved from the Protestant north of Germany to the very much Catholic south of Germany in Munich, and he moved from a very stolid sort of economy-focused town to Munich, which was also the center of the arts in Germany around the turn of the century, where there was a very large bohemian scene. So this conflict between the North and the South, between Protestantism and Catholicism, between a responsible life and the artistic life, that is very much present in all of his stories. If you think about Tonio Kröger, he moves from the South to the North in his story. Aschenbach moves from north of the Alps to south of the Alps, and Hans Castorp in The Magic Mountain also moves from the north to the south. That is in the opening chapter of this novel. That's an important translocation. There are other translocations, of course. The journey to the Magic Mountain is not just a journey from the north to the south. It is also, of course, a journey into the realm of the dead, right? You have that. Hans Castorp takes a very odd path to the Magic Mountain, one that is not borne out by railway tables of the time at all. He travels to Lake Constance. He takes a boat over Lake Constance and then takes all these small railways as he ascends the Magic Mountain. Why does he do that? Well, because he is reenacting, just like Aschenbach, the classical journey into the realm of the dead, which takes you downwards and then over a body of water. And then the idea of traveling upwards to the actual Magic Mountain is one that Mann likely got from Dante. Magic Mountain shares with the underworld in Dante's Divine Comedy also the fact that at the innermost circle there are a bunch of people who are hot on the inside, they're all feverish, but they live in cold environments, right? At the heart of Dante's hell is Satan surrounded by a sea of ice. So it is a metaphorical journey into the underworld in addition to this journey of north to south. It is also a journey into a fairy tale realm. There are dwarves, there is never-ending food. You're inside of a mountain, which is very much a fairy tale theme that occurs in a number of tales in German. So there are all sorts of ways in which this can be read. But Mann was forever, for his entire life, influenced by this shift from north to south in early youth. His mother, Julia da Silva Bruns, who is the one in the photo on the top, was of Brazilian Creole descent. So she was born she had a Brazilian mother, a German father, and as a young woman returned to Lübeck, where her German family was from, was very much an exotic figure there. And in 1906, Mann married a woman in Munich named Katja Pringsheim, who was half Jewish. And this is another important theme in Thomas Mann's novels. There's not only a north-south dimension, there's also a conflict between the European West and its racial and religious others, which, for whatever reason, in Thomas Mann's fictions are rarely figured as Latin American. More often, Thomas Mann projects this onto the East, onto the Slavic realm, onto Asia, not the Far East, not Japan, China, but Russia, the Eastern European countries. You see this in the Magic Mountain as well, and the great character of Claudia Schoscha, or Claudia Schoscha, I should say, who comes from Eastern Europe. She has these Kyrgyz eyes, she's described as having. She is very much a temptress figure. She also possibly brings something like death or corruption to Hans Castorp. She seduces him I believe you're at the very end of chapter 5? You're at the part in the Magic Mountain, at any rate, where that famous dialogue between Castorp and Claudia Schoscha in French happens, and where Hans Castorp goes to her room late at night and sleeps with her. So the seduction happens, and this sort of Western Castorp is very much a figure not just of the North but also of the Western European tradition, and these elements that Mann knew were inside him. Right? He had this Brazilian blood inside him. He was a bit of an outsider by the norms of ordinary German society. He was very much aware of that. That is to be found in his fiction everywhere as well. Thomas Mann, this is also really important, was gay. I'm sure you've discussed this already. It's something that his wife and later his children knew and tolerated. We know from his diaries that he was gay. The man on the oil painting to the right is Paul Ehrenberg, who was the closest thing to a romantic and sexual love of his life that Mann ever had. He was, I'm sure, in love with Katja as well, but it was less a sexual or even romantic love and more a love born from comradeship and the fact that the two, he and his wife, really worked together very well as an entity. Katja sort of managed his affairs and was worldly in a way that Thomas Mann never really was. Mann's homosexuality is a difficult topic, especially when I talk to students nowadays. Their conception of what being gay or being queer, we would nowadays more likely say, means is so different from the conception in the late 19th, early 20th century that they oftentimes have a hard time even understanding that. I can go into further detail in the question and answer period if we want, but I will just say that I've read pretty much everything that Thomas Mann has ever written, and he does not strike me as somebody who was particularly repressed in the sense of unhappy. He made a conscious choice that he did not want to live out his sexuality because he had this belief that if he did, he would not be able to focus on his art. And for him, art always topped everything. He knew that that was where he wanted to put all his energies. And so he made this very conscious decision to marry Katja because he thought it would keep him on a respectable path. And Katja knew what was going on with him and was very kind towards him. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that. I will just point out that you can find those homoerotic elements in pretty much all of Mann's stories as well, including the ones that you've read. In Tonio Kröger, it's the one between Tonio and what's his name, Hans Hansen, the boy with the horse pictures. In Death in Venice, it's very, very obvious. In Mario and the Magician, Cipolla's seduction is a homoerotic seduction of sorts, and you see it in The Magic Mountain as well, in the relationship between Hans Castorp and his cousin Joachim Ziemßen. I mean, I don't want to imply that there's like anything sexual going on between them, but if you read the descriptions of Ziemßen very carefully, they're filled with a tenderness that I think very much points towards that. And of course, you see it in The Magic Mountain as well with the seduction by Claudia Schoscha, because she essentially becomes the modern incarnation of this boy that Hans Castorp knew in childhood, Přibyslav Hippe. And there's this like really marvelous or marvelously weird phallic symbol with a pencil that they play with. So there's all sorts of things like that going on. I'm sort of running out of time here, so I need to speed up a little bit. Another important thing about The Magic Mountain is that Mann always relied on autobiographical experiences as an influence for his stories. And The Magic Mountain, of course, was very much influenced by an actual stay in a Davos sanatorium in 1912, as were Death in Venice and The Mario and the Magician, which are all based on vacation episodes that actually happened to Thomas Mann. And the doctors in Davos was a really important spa town in the early 20th century, were really not happy by the publication of The Magic Mountain because they thought it would be bad for business, the way in which he had turned his experiences in Switzerland into this novel, to the point that when Mann lived in Switzerland in the 1930s as an exile from Nazi Germany, there were people in Switzerland who tried to get him kicked out based on the lasting influence of this novel. The hatred was so extreme that they would have handed him back over to the Nazis if they could have. So almost everything in all of these tales is autobiographically influenced. That's important to know. The Magic Mountain was begun in 1913, was interrupted by the First World War in 1915. And then Thomas Mann changed from being a conservative and a staunch monarchist to being very much a liberal Democrat in the early 1920s. And the composition of of the Magic Mountain reflects this. You need to understand that this is a novel that was not written in one go. It was a novel, the first third of which, roughly, was written before and during the early stages of the First World War, when Mann was very much a believer in the German war aims and in the emperor, the Kaiser. And then the rest of the tale was written when he had changed his mind or had evolved into becoming a Democrat. And that is not a dimension of the novel that you have seen very much so far, but you will in your remaining readings of The Magic Mountain. I will just point out to you that you should pay close attention to the character of Settembrini. Because when Settembrini is introduced in the novel, he's very much sort of a clown figure, and he's oftentimes ridiculed. And the reason for that is that he's a figure of the Enlightenment of the West, also of democracy. And when Thomas Mann invented this character, these were all things that he viewed with great suspicion. But Settembrini becomes much more of a noble character over the course of the novel as Mann continues the writing process from a changed political perspective, to the point that he invents a brilliant antithesis to Settembrini, whom you haven't met yet, one of the great characters in The Magic Mountain, a character named Nafta, to be able to play off these 2 points against one another. So that's maybe something to make note of for future reading. Okay, and then I just want to briefly highlight the rest of Mann's life after The Magic Mountain, and then I'm done. So he converts to democracy in the early 1920s, becomes one of the great intellectual champions of the Weimar Republic, a defender of democracy, of German democracy. He also becomes very much a European writer who travels throughout Europe and lectures throughout Europe. He wins the Nobel Prize in 1929. That is a good sign of his having become more than just a national writer, an international writer. He also speaks up forcefully against the Nazis, which earns him a place high up on their list of enemies. The photo that you see to the right-hand side is a very famous one of him giving a pro-democracy address in 1930 in Berlin, and the lecture is interrupted by Nazi stormtroopers. So the reason why his audience is all facing away from him and looking towards the back of the hall is that Mann is being heckled by Nazi brown shirts. Well, actually, they were wearing tuxedos because else they wouldn't have gotten in, but they were Nazi brown shirts from the back of the hall. And so when Hitler becomes to power, Mann very fortunately happens to be on vacation in Switzerland, and it takes him a while to understand how grave the situation actually is. But his children call him and say, "Do not come back. You need to stay." And he does stay and will never for the rest of his life return permanently to Germany. Instead, he lives until 1938. He lives in Switzerland. But eventually, Switzerland becomes a little bit dangerous as well, because it becomes increasingly clear that Hitler is going to try and conquer Europe. And Switzerland is a small, almost defenseless country. So what if he invades Switzerland? So like many other people who emigrated to Switzerland in the 1930s, he looks for a home elsewhere and is fortunate enough that because he is so famous, he's able to emigrate to the United States. He first takes a job as a lecturer at Princeton University, but then he's ultimately not very happy at the East Coast. He moves to Los Angeles, to Pacific Palisades in 1941, where, as probably some of you know, there was a big exile community. He earned money in addition to his novels. He was a very rich man, lived very well, but he made extra income by giving frequent pro-democracy lecture tours and speeches. And I love this poster on the right-hand side. This poster hangs outside my office, and you can see that he was praised by his promoters as the greatest living man of letters. He was very much a celebrity in America in the 1930s that is almost unimaginable for us today. He was a fervent supporter of Roosevelt as well and of the New Deal, became a US citizen in 1944, supported various Democratic politicians throughout the 1940s. And then starting in around 1947, his relationship with America soured because during the McCarthy era, he, like many other German emigres, was targeted for what in the jargon of the time was known as premature anti-fascism, meaning he had spoken out against Hitler before it was fashionable, which in McCarthy era America made you a communist, basically. I mean, Thomas Mann was not a communist. He was at best a social democrat. But things became very ugly for a lot of Germans at the time. Not so much for Thomas Mann, although he was surveilled by the FBI. But he was an old man and he became more and more disillusioned with what happened in the United States. And so eventually he decided to go back to Europe in 1952, but he could not bear to return to Germany. He was very mistrustful of Germany after the Nazi era. So he went back to Switzerland, where he eventually died in 1955. He was revered in East Germany after his death because he had spoken out so openly against Hitler. It took the West Germans a lot longer to regain his trust in Germany, but he is now very, very much a canonical writer in Germany. At least if you're of my generation, you definitely read Thomas Mann, oftentimes Tonio Kröger, in high school. I'm not sure if they still do with everything that's going on in terms of changing reading habits. But he was he's very much in Germany at the center of the canon. And his life story, precisely because it's so rich in marvelous anecdotes, there are endless biographies written about him. There are TV specials, there are TV shows, movies about the Mann family. So it's very much, he entered the public domain just last year. So his publisher Thomas Mann was the golden goose that kept on giving for his publisher right until last year, just because he was so popular. In the United States, he more or less slipped into obscurity. Death in Venice, still commonly read, especially in great books courses. Occasionally, The Magic Mountain in courses on modernist literature, though it's very much a long novel. So I know from firsthand experience, it's getting harder and harder to get college students to read novels that long. And there's been a minor renaissance in recent years following a resurgence of interest in the fascist period. I'll leave it up to your imagination what it might be that has fired interest in fascism in recent years, and the opening of the Thomas Mann House in Pacific Palisades in 2018. So that's what you see on the right-hand side. That is Thomas Mann's house in Los Angeles, where he lived for, like 11 years. That house still exists. You can see he was a rich man. It's a very nice place. I've had the good fortune of staying there for a few nights. It is now a research center owned by the German government, where the German government brings scholars to further German-American dialogue. That's why I was there. That's why other people are there. And so the German government is actually actively investing money into Thomas Mann as a conduit to increase or to better relationships between the United States and Germany. Okay, and I went on for about 10 minutes longer than I promised I would. I apologize for that. Professors are wont to do that, but I hope you find it interesting, and I'm very happy to answer any questions you might have.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, would you be willing to stop sharing your screen?
Yeah, sorry about
So
that.
I can actually see people.
Yeah.
What I'd love you to do, I don't know if you can, either you can raise your hand like this, or if you want to raise your hand virtually.
I'm not, Heather, I'm not sure I'm able to stop up. Did that stop the screen share?
No. Let's
Uh,
see.
I don't see
You
a,
see the share on the bottom?
yeah, when I press on that, there's usually a stop share button, but it's
Oh,
not,
there is not a shop stop.
I mean, there should be.
Um,
Oh, here we go. Yeah, found it.
got it.
There we
Okay.
go. Sorry about that.
No, don't worry. Okay. Hold on. I'm going to try to view everyone. Does anyone have a question before I
I think we have one question there.
we do have one question. Okay. Oh, I see. Suzanne.
Thank you very much for your talk. It really helps us. Um, my group that just met last week, we are enthralled by Magic Mountain. We just are loving it. And one of our questions is always about whose words are we really reading here, since we're reading it in translation. And I'd like you to talk about um, the art of translation specifically as it relates to Thomas Mann.
Okay, that is a rich and interesting question. So first of all, I assume all of you are reading the James E. Woods translation of the Magic Mountain, which is really the standard translation that we have at this moment. So, but it's not the only one. Thomas Mann had, during his own lifetime, a translator by the name of Helen Tracy Lowe Porter, who's a really interesting woman. Interesting, not the least for the fact that she was a woman. In early 20th century letters, doing translation work was one of the ways in which women could find recognition that was oftentimes denied them if they tried to be novelists of their own. Constance Garnett is another really important example of that, who translated a lot of Russian literature into English. Um, Thomas Mann had sort of a love-hate relationship with Helen Tracy Lowe Porter. He didn't speak English very well, so he wasn't able to offer detailed critiques of her translations. He liked the fact that she worked very quickly. But as he became older and older, he became more and more disenchanted with her. So it was not always an easy relationship. Helen Tracy Lowe Porter's translations nowadays are much maligned, I would say, because she took a sort of antiquizing approach to his prose. She translated him very much as though he was a 19th century author. She tried to make him dignified in a way, or distant in a way that Thomas Mann isn't really in the German original. I share that concern about it. As I said at the beginning of my presentation, I'm always very interested in seeing Thomas Mann as a 20th century author, as a literary radical. But I've also done research into the marketing strategies for Thomas Mann, and it's undeniable that Thomas Mann became as successful in the United States as he did because he was translated in such an accessible way, or such a, nowadays we would say maybe middlebrow way by Helen Tracy Lowe Porter. So I think that's an interesting dimension as well. James E. Woods, I think, is a really first-rate translator who does a very good job of bringing Thomas Mann to you. If you don't like the Woods translation, or if you want to compare it to other translations, you should know that there are two more translations of the Magic Mountain coming out in the next few months. Why this flood? Well, for two reasons. First of all, last year was the centenary, and different publishers were trying to publish new versions of the Magic Mountain, but the novel is so long and so difficult to translate that nobody made the deadline. So now those books are coming out in 2026 rather than in 2024. That's one reason. The other reason is that the copyright just fell away. So it's now a lot easier to translate the Magic Mountain. So there's a version by Susan Bernofsky coming out. I've read large parts of that version at various workshops, and it's fantastic as well. So you can try that. And there's one by, I believe, a British publisher. I don't know off the top of my head. I'm not involved with that. I don't know anything about it, but I'm sure it's good too. So you can compare different versions. Does something get lost in translation? Something essential to the tale? Well, certainly. One thing that Mann does throughout the book that is impossible to do in English is he plays with tenses. German has two different tenses for the past tense, the present perfect and the preterite tense. And Mann uses those tenses very skillfully in the passages of novels that deal with the passage of time. there's all these philosophical discussions about the passage of time, and he tries to give you a grammatical demonstration of what he is intellectually talking about in the novel. And that is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to render in English. So Mann is very much worth reading in the original. He's one of those authors. Um, I mean, it's always better to read literature in the original, but there are some authors like Kafka, for example, that translate relatively well. Some authors that are a lot harder to translate, and I would argue that Mann falls in that latter category. I don't mean to be dismissive or discouraging in any way, but it is unfortunate that despite the heroic efforts of translators that we have, something will get lost.
There's some chat questions. I'll ask, you were just talking about time. Timothy asks, where does Mann's meditation on time come from? His meditations on time.
And that's a good question. There's a whole slew baked into the Magic Mountain. I must confess that's not a topic that I'm particularly a subject expert on. Certainly, so I said earlier in my presentation that I wasn't going to talk about Schopenhauer because he's not really that present in the parts of the novel that you've read so far. Well, certainly the treatment of time is indebted to that. That's undeniable. The late 19th, early 20th century was a period in which philosophy was very much interested in issues of time. Bergson, for example, the French philosopher Henri Bergson, had a huge influence on the modernist novel in general, including on Thomas Mann. So that's important there as well. But then also, I mean, moving beyond the intellectual stuff, there is the personal experience. I mean, I think it's really important to remember The Magic Mountain is a novel based on an actual stay in a sanatorium that Thomas and Katja underwent in, I think, 1912. And the episode where Castorp is, where the doctor Behrens convinces Castorp to stay because he tells him that he is sick too. That is something that's very much rooted in personal experience as well. The doctors in Davos tried to get Thomas Mann to stay. He knew better. He left as soon as he heard that. He wanted to get the hell out of there because he knew he wouldn't be able to continue writing if he stayed. So, these things about how long do you stay, how does time pass when you have nothing to do, and so on. These for a workaholic like Thomas Mann was, who went on a vacation where he was basically told for your health not to do anything. That flows into the novel as well. And then a final element, of course, are fairy tales. So the passage of time is very much tied to the number 7 in many different ways. I think you already, I don't want to give anything away, but if I remember the novel correctly, the narrator tells you this at the very beginning on the first page. Castorp is going to stay there for 7 years, as you know. He stays in room 34, 3 plus 4 and so on. So there's all these number games. There are all these fairy tale element games. And of course, there are plenty of stories, both in German fairy tales, or think of the story of Rip van Winkle, which Thomas Mann knew about passing time and time slowing down and so on. So he plays with that as well. So it's really sort of a heady mixture of philosophical sources, of literary sources, but also personal experience.
Hey, great. Angela, you'll have.
Yeah, I unmuted. I thank you for this lecture. It's really, really helpful to all of us. I loved Suzanne's question where she asks, whose words are we reading here? And my question is somewhat related. Whose voice are we hearing? Can you talk a little bit to us about the narrator? And in what ways do you see our narrator as being somewhat postmodern? And do you see some postmodern influences in the novel as well?
Yeah, so that's a loaded question. Is it a postmodern? I mean, so the straightforward answer to the question, are there postmodern elements in this, is of course not, because I mean, post literally means after, right? Like you need to have the modern movement first before you can be postmodern. So if I want to be like a strict didactic literary historian, I would say, well, we don't really get to postmodernism until the 1970s or so. And Mann belongs to the generation that invents what the postmodernists react against. But are there elements in the Magic Mountain that very much remind us of what the postmodernists will later do? Well, absolutely yes. So, and that's even more true of Mann's later work, especially of Dr. Faustus, and which is a novel that he publishes in 1947, so much later than the Magic Mountain. And what you just called the postmodern elements, or which I would prefer to call the elements of Thomas Mann's modernist prose that prefigure things that the postmodernists very much picked up and reacted against. So postmodernists are the generation of people like Thomas Pynchon, for example, in the 1960s and 70s. If you've seen the recent film One Battle After Another, which is based on a Thomas Pynchon novel, the kind of like weird, almost hyper realism, like it seems like a realistic tale, but then it's like deeply weird. Some of those characters, the Sean Penn character in that film is clearly not like not a very realistic character, right? That's what we're talking about when we're talking about postmodernism. So the voice of Magic Mountain, you rightly say that's one of the most studied things in the novel, and the voice is clearly never straightforward. It's a very ironic voice. It's sort of all-knowing, but at the same time somewhat mocking of Castorp, but also very sympathetic to the narrator, to Castorp. That is something that is oftentimes cited as a postmodern influence, and that sort of vaguely ironic voice you find in almost all fictions, or in all fictions of Thomas Mann. It's one of the hallmarks of his prose. One of the biggest issues in literary studies for the kind of people who from within academia study Thomas Mann, and this is a battle that's waged for more than 100 years, is whether the narrator of Death in Venice is sympathetic to Gustav Aschenbach or actually condemns him as somehow morally dissolute or something like that. And there's no real straightforward answer to that question. That question has been tossed back and forth. And it's sort of the same way with the narrator in The Magic Mountain.
Okay, great. Harmon?
Yes, thank you so much for a wonderful lecture. I was wondering if the two philosophers that you mentioned, Settembrini and Naphtha, were based on characters that he met either while on his own Magic Mountain, or were they supposed to be actual philosophers, or were they just things that Mann conceived by himself?
Yeah, they're sort of compound figures. They're not straightforward imitations of any one person. For Settembrini, for example, his appearance is inspired by one of the late 19th century Italian opera composers. I think Leon Cavallo. It might be somebody else, but one of those Italian composers. Mann looked at a portrait of that guy and basically sketched his physical figures in the novel based on that. But then he is very much a compound figure of various in post-Enlightenment sort of rationalist kind of philosophers. Naphtha, whom most of you haven't met yet, is very much inspired by the Hungarian philosopher Georg Lukács. There's a sort of sly joke that Mann throws out in the novel, in that Nafta lives in like the attic apartment of a tailor in town, and the tailor's name is Lukacek. So there's a hint in the name of the landlord of Nafta, to whom he actually is. So yes, like, and you can do this for all figures in Thomas Mann, both big and small. Even minor characters in Thomas Mann are almost never invented whole cloth. They're always inspired by people whom Mann knew personally, or whom he read about, whom he had biographies of. Mann stole and plagiarized and patched together rather than invent things from the ground up. And there's an entire cottage industry in academia to track down all these sources, and people publish entire articles based on totally minor details that they've found link one of Mann's characters to another figure. It's kind of a fun game, but I think as you're reading Thomas Mann, you should be aware that there are these real life influences, but I don't think it's particularly productive to try and read The Magic Mountain as a roman à clé. That is, don't read it as a novel where you need to figure out which people precisely the characters stand for, because only then are you going to understand them. You've all met Settembrini. You need to understand that he is a ridiculously rationalist and inspired by the Enlightenment, and also by 19th century liberal nationalism kind of figure, who parodies the worst tendencies of all that, with that massive encyclopedia project that he's participating in, which is like ultimately a totally worthless project, but that he has devoted his life to. Those sorts of things, those render him vaguely ridiculous, but he's also, of course, a sympathetic character. There's also very much to like about him, and it's the same way with Nafta.
Before I call on you, Victoria, I'm going to do one more chat. Can you say more about what Liebestod, did I say that right, means to Mann in Magic Mountain? Marcia.
So I don't want to give away the ending of the novel, right? The idea of Liebestod, of love, death, is of course, that's something that happens at the end of works, because it's like the big climax of everything. And I don't want to give away, I don't want to give away what happens to Hans Castorp at the end of the story. I will say that if we want to link the elements of love and death in the tale, there are various ways in which we can do that. One is through the character of Joachim Ziemßen, the cousin that Hans Castorp has. I don't think you've come to his death scene yet, have you? No. So sorry, spoiler alert, he will eventually die. There's definitely a connection between love and death there. But the more interesting connection, the more central for the Magic Mountain, occurs in the character of Claudia Chauchat. So Chauchat, first of all, what does the name mean? Well, Chauchat, if you know any French, is like, Thomas Mann is great with character names and is great with innuendos and little jokes. So Chauchat means hot cat, right? Or hot kitten. For a seductress figure, that's a really funny kind of name. But Chauchat is also the name of the inventor, the real life name of the inventor of the most efficient machine gun in World War I, sorry. The machine gun that the French troops carried into battle in World War I was called the Chauchat, after the guy who invented it. And it was such a devastating machine that the German soldiers, whenever they managed to overrun French positions, took those machine guns and used them for their own, replaced their own machine guns with the French version. So it is an instrument of death, And that instrument of death is furthermore linked to death in another form, that Claudia Szosza is clearly the adult, grown-up version of Hans Castorp's childhood love, this boy, Přibyslav Hippe, that he had a crush on, a homoerotic crush on as a boy. And the last name Hippe is the German word for scythe, as in the instrument that the Grim Reaper carries. So, Szosza has death, or is associated with both love. Castorp falls hopelessly in love with her, but she is also associated with death. And as you read the novel, you should think about why that is and what Szosza's influence is in the novel. I mean, we already know that Castorp stays on the Magic Mountain for as long as he does, in large part because of Szosza, because he hopes to see Szosza again. And it is, of course, not good for him that he stays on the Magic Mountain for so long. It's a wonderful place, but just like you shouldn't hang out in fairy tale caves for too long, like Rip Van Winkle, Castorp should also not hang out there. Like, the better thing for him to do would have been to leave the Magic Mountain and start building ships in Hamburg like he's supposed to, right? So she is a dark seductress figure in that sense. She doesn't kill Hans Castorp, so it's not a love death in the full-blown sense of the word. But if I had to link that theme to the Magic Mountain, that's how I would do it.
Great. You make me feel like I have to read this novel like 7 more times too. So many layers.
Well, as somebody who has read it at least 7 more times, you find new things through every pass through. It really is a multi-layered novel.
Victoria?
Thank you for taking my question. As a Jungian psychologist, I'm very interested in what you might have to say about Mann's relationship with Jung. I know they met in 1933 when they both were living in Kunstnacht. I just was curious about any influences that might have happened, either conscious or unconscious, because it seems in reading this that there is a lot of influence.
Yeah, I think I'm going to have to pass on that question.
okay.
That is not a topic I know anything about. What is certainly true is that that Mann greatly admired Freud, as you probably know, wrote 1 or 2, I forget, important essays on Freud. I forget off the top of my head when he first read Freud, when Mann first read Freud. I think it was relatively late. I think it wasn't until the 1920s. But Freud was definitely an important figure on him, although I would caution against reading his novels through an overtly literal psychoanalytic, Freudian or Jungian psychoanalytic lens, because that's not, I mean, Mann admired Freud, but he didn't absorb him in the same way that he absorbed the people of his youth, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Wagner. I don't think he ever made much of a conscious attempt to sort of illustrate Freudian theories in his novels. He maybe came closest in the Joseph novels, the great Joseph tetralogy of the 1930s and 1940s. And there's a famous scene of dream interpretation in there, for example, and stuff like that. So Freud was definitely an influence on Thomas Mann, though I would say a second degree or a second-rate influence compared to the first degree influence that I've been talking about in my talk here. Jung, I don't know. You're right that they met, but I don't know personally very much about how much he read of Jung. I mean, again, the Joseph novels, which are concerned with primordial myths and with myths as they pass between cultures and the universals of myths, those would be the most immediate place to look for answers to that question, but I'm not an expert.
Okay, thank you.
We're at the end of the time. We do have one more question in chat. do you?
Of course, go right ahead. Yeah, of course.
Okay. Any more thoughts on the effect of World War I on his writing? And we're also, some of my group members and myself are struggling with, we know that this was written, Magic Mountain, as like kind of setting as like right before the war. And so we're trying to figure out like passages and scenes that are kind of like, what is it saying exactly about that?
Yeah, this is difficult because, again, the novel really doesn't become a full-fledged reflection on the First World War until the last couple of chapters, right? I mean, the last couple of chapters, of course, you will have all noticed that the novel is divided into 7 chapters and they get successively longer, right? Which is an argument about time in and of itself. So when I say the last 2 chapters, we're really dealing with like half the novel, basically. And those are the chapters in which the First World War is most explicitly dealt with, in the sense that the novel acquires a political side that is hard to see in the sections that you've read so far. When Thomas Mann began The Magic Mountain, he didn't mean for it to be a political novel. He, in fact, you've probably maybe even mentioned this in your groups, because it's a great way to transition from Death in Venice to The Magic Mountain. The Magic Mountain was originally planned as a comical counterpart to Death in Venice. If Death in Venice is a tragedy, The Magic Mountain was supposed to be a comedy, but basically tell a very similar story. I mean, they're both about men who come from a very sort of, I don't know, Protestant ethic, kind of work ethic kind of background, but move southwards and things go wrong for them, right? That's how the novel was planned. And most of the novel that you've read so far falls under that compositional schema. And you won't get to the parts most explicitly concerned with the First World War until later. But I would urge you to think about the characters of Settembrini, of Nafta, and about Minher Peppercorn. Nafta, I think, comes up in chapter 6. Peppercorn is in chapter 7, as not just really interesting and bizarre characters in their own right, but also of illustrations of different ways of social organization, of political life. So Settembrini comes to resemble, again, he's not this at the beginning of the novel, but he comes to represent liberal, enlightened democracy, Western Europe. Nafta comes to represent both monarchism, but also looking forward. He's a really interesting precursor of totalitarianism, not something that Mann would have had firsthand experience with in 1924. But nevertheless, one of the reasons why the novel endures in the way that it has done is that he really draws something out there in Nafta that would become relevant later in the 20th century. So think of him as that, and I'll leave it for yourself to figure out what you think Minher Peppercorn represents. But they have these 3 social tendencies, and they are sparring with one another in the way that Mann would have argued the First World War was a result of different social systems in Europe having come to the bursting point. The old order of Europe as it existed in the 19th century no longer being able to go on in an age of modern mass politics, in an age of increasing suffrage, where more and more people had the right to vote, and you therefore needed to appeal to voters in ways that were radically different from the way that they were in the 19th century. All these pressures that were being put on the European countries in the early 20th century, they are sort of, they come through in these characters. But of course, there's also, I mean, one simple way in which you can read the novel about the First World War that's maybe not as abstruse as what I've just outlined, is that ultimately it's a novel about a bunch of upper class people who are stuck in the sanatorium in in the mountains and who are completely removed from what is happening in the world around them, who pay no attention to that, who just chase one another's skirts and chase good food and so on. And they're sort of, that's a much more simplistic but equally biting, I think, way in which to approach this as a social critique.
Wonderful. Okay, and I will ask one final question. If we want to read something next of Thomas Mann, would you suggest Buddenbrooks or Dr. Faustus? What is your preference?
Well, since I just published a book called A Reader's Guide to Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus, I of course encourage you to read Dr. Faustus. But Dr. Faustus is a very difficult novel that requires even more engagement with German culture and sort of background reading in order to understand everything that is going on. So it can be an immensely rewarding read. It's my personal favorite of Mann's novels. I think together with The Magic Mountain and Dr. Faustus are his two greatest achievements. So if you're the kind of person who enjoys this sort of hunting down the mysteries element in a book that you need to do to a certain extent already in The Magic Mountain, Dr. Faustus multiplies that tenfold. And my book, which, I'm not trying to sell any books to you. It is available, as was said in the introduction. You can download it for free to your Kindle or whatever. It'll help you understand Dr. Faustus. So that's a direction to go in if you like those mysteries. If you want the pure reading pleasure and you want a really great novel that reads much more like a 19th century novel, go for Buddenbrooks. I mean, Buddenbrooks is to this day the most popular Thomas Mann novel in Germany. And the reason for that is that you don't need a degree in literature. You don't need to spend endless amounts of time on Wikipedia to hunt various things down in order to understand it. It's very much a late 19th century novel. It's one of the first things that Thomas Mann ever wrote before even Tonio Kröger. And it is a great novel. It's a fantastic novel. So either of those are good choices. Thomas Mann never did short novels, right? Both Dr. Faustus and Buddenbrooks are over 500 pages long. They're roughly the same length as The Magic Mountain. So if you find that daunting, I would actually recommend you just stick to someone. I mean, you already bought these volumes of shorter Thomas Mann fictions, I think, and read some of those. I mean, his short fiction is every bit as good as his longer novels. One story that I frequently teach that I think is vastly underrated, it's rarely discussed, especially here in America, and I think it's in one of the editions that you bought, is Disorder and Early Sorrow, which is a story that he wrote in the 1920s. It's about the period of hyperinflation in Germany. As maybe some of you know, Germany went through a really, really bad period of inflation in 1922 and 1923 especially. And the social turmoil that brought on was one of the triggers that eventually then that also fed into Nazism. And it's an autobiographical story, a thinly veiled version of his own family living through one day in inflation-torn Germany. And it's about a father who has to come to terms with the fact that his daughter is growing, his very young daughter, she's like 6 years old or whatever in the story, but that she's growing up, won't be a child forever, and that he won't be the greatest figure in her life forever. Maybe because I have a daughter myself, that hits home especially hard. But it's a beautiful story about love between a father and his daughter, but also about what it means to come of age in these very weird times. So, try some of the shorter stories if you don't want to try your hands at a big novel. But anything by Thomas Mann is always worth reading.
Thank you so very much. Like, really, if everyone wants to go off mute and clap, it was really such a great lecture. We really,
Well,
really appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody. For somebody like me who's devoted a lot of time to studying and teaching Thomas Mann, there's obviously nothing more gratifying than to see that people still read him, and that they do so not just in college courses where people like me have assigned him. So I wish you all the very, very best with your further journey with Thomas Mann. I hope you enjoy the Magic Mountain and whatever else of his that you choose to read in the future.